Meeting to order. Will the city clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Stewart. Councilmember Kovar. Councilmember DeBala.
Here.
Councilmember Costick. Here. Councilmember Smith. Councilmember Searcy. Here. Mayor Pro Tem Siemens.
Present. All right, well, welcome everyone. As you see, a few of the council members and the mayor are not here yet. They all have said that they were here in the meeting. I know that Mayor Stewart is at another important city meeting and will be delayed getting here. I did hear from the other two council members that they're coming later, but I'll let them explain what they've been doing while they're gone. Right, we have agenda tonight. We have several public hearings and a few things to vote on. Just before we start, we'd like to take a minute and ask that we all have a minute of silence in respect for the passing of Congressman Elijah Cummings this week. So if we could just pause for a minute. Thank you for that. Tonight, we also have a substitute for the city manager. Daryl Braithwaite, the Director of Public Works, is sitting in for the city manager, and she is here tonight, so we appreciate that. And another thing before the meeting starts, I would just like to wish Ms. Braithwaite a happy birthday. I understand you're another year younger today. And I believe we had a little something for you. A little cake for Ms. Braithwaite. So, okay. So we have carrot cake for Ms. Braithwaite. Happy birthday. I think we should all give her a round of applause, don't you? All right, thank you. Do we have any minutes tonight?
We do not.
Okay, then let's move on to the public hearings. These public hearings have been scheduled to hear comments on proposed amendments to the Tacoma Park Charter. The amendments were recommended by the Tacoma Park Board of Elections, presented to the council on June 5th, and discussed by the council on September 18th. The public hearings were advertised in the Tacoma Park newsletter, in the Montgomery Sentinel, and on the city website, and the text of the proposed amendments was posted on the website. Tonight's agenda includes 3 public hearings because the amendments affect 3 articles of the charter. Article 3, the council. Article 5, amendment procedures, and Article 6, registration, nominations, and elections. The charter amendment resolution will be prepared for each article. First reading of the charter amendment resolutions is scheduled for November 6th. There are sign-up sheets over here. I don't know if anyone has signed up to speak at those public hearings. It's not necessary since we don't have a vast crowd here with us tonight, so we can take people in order. Are there any comments tonight on the proposed amendments to Article 3 of the Charter City Council? Seeing none, are there any comments on the proposed amendments to Article 5 of the Charter, amendment procedures? Okay, and again, not seeing any. Are there any comments on proposed amendments to Article 6, registration, nominations, and elections? Okay. Okay, last call for comments on the public hearings. Not seeing any. The public hearing is now closed. Residents are welcome to make additional comments at future meetings or by email, and they can email the city clerk would be the best way. All right, thank you. So we finished the first page of the agenda tonight. We're just winging along here. Be done before the other council members get in. All right, are there any public comments on any of our other voting items tonight? And I hope you all got a copy of the agenda by the door. Okay, are there any other, I guess we have, before we do that, we have our voting session. And tonight we have a consent agenda which includes a single reading ordinance of approving replacement vehicle purchases. That would be 2 pickup trucks for Public Works. A single reading ordinance approving replacement vehicle purchase for a dump truck. A single reading ordinance approving replacement vehicle purchase for a sedan. A single reading ordinance approving purchase of replacement computers and Adobe Creative Cloud licenses. Also on the consent agenda is a resolution authorizing the city manager to execute a memorandum of understanding with the Montgomery County Board of Elections. A resolution approving community development block grant program project. A single reading ordinance approving indefinite quantities contract for street, sidewalk, and stormwater structure construction with DNF Construction. A single reading ordinance approving indefinite quantities contract for street, sidewalk, and stormwater structure construction with NZI Construction Corporation. And lastly, a single reading ordinance authorizing execution of a contract for speed cameras. Would anyone care to move the consent agenda? And a second? Okay. Any, I guess we call the vote.
Great. Councilmember Kovar, Councilmember DeBala,
Yes.
Councilmember Costick, Councilmember Smith, Councilmember Searcy,
Yes.
Mayor Stewart, Mayor Pro Tem Siemens.
Aye. All right, so that carries. And we'll move on to other public comments. Does anyone wish to speak tonight? And when you step to the podium, please state your name and address, and know that you have 3 minutes. You'll get a warning 30 seconds before the 3 minutes is up.
Colleen Cordes, Ward 1. I wanted to talk about trees. The Committee on the Environment, which I'm a brand new member of, has submitted some draft preliminary goals. And as I understand it, is really looking forward to the council's discussion of it and also some process of community participation in it so that we could then go back. I'm not speaking for the committee right now. I just want to say that in that context, I'm making these comments. So it seems like one of the really important things is for the council to take a pause and really refocus on the goals first, because the goals are going to make such a difference in how you decide to revise the ordinance. They should, at least, because there are 3 emergencies in front of us right now: the climate emergency, the global biodiversity emergency in terms of the extinction crisis, and then our own very local emergency this summer and fall with the sudden die-off of scores of oak trees. And all of these things, I think, put us in a different place than when the council began talking about revising the tree ordinance, especially because we're still working on our sustainability and climate action plan. We have new concerns about stormwater management, and we don't really understand what's happening with the oak trees. So this is a time, it seems like, we really need to focus on putting into context what are our goals related to responding to these emergencies, and then going into the tree ordinance. And especially, by the way, my time is not moving here. I still have 3 minutes.
You have a good mayor, don't you?
But it seems like it's not a time to be rushing to a decision about making it easier to cut down trees that are assessed as being non-hazardous. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about waivers or not getting a waiver. You get a waiver if your tree is assessed as being hazardous or dead. So to weaken that at a time when we're facing these 3 emergencies for which we know trees are really, really important is not something that seems to make much sense. The other thing is the solar issue, solar panels on top of houses. And allowing, making it easier to cut down trees for that. That's another thing that at this moment seems especially ill-advised, especially if you look at all of the many environmental benefits on this flyer that the subcommittee, the Committee on the Environment, and the Tree Commission prepared in 2016. You can see that there's so many benefits both for mitigating climate change, for resiliency, and also a wide range of other environmental benefits that solar panels on our houses just cannot match. So I hope that you will take a pause in this process and really go back to focus on, in this emergency situation, knowing our trees are so important as a response and are so vulnerable themselves. How can we deal with this emergency situation? And then put the revision of the tree ordinance in that context. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Anyone else care to speak?
Good evening. I'm Ken Flemmer, the Executive Director of Avernus Community Services on Sligo Avenue, and for tonight, that's my address, 501 Sligo. Avernus Community Services, it's been a long time since I've been up here to speak to the council. It's, the center has served Tacoma Park and Silver Spring for over 35 years. Avernus Community Services has been part of the holiday giving, a county-wide coordination of Thanksgiving and Christmas baskets and distributing toys. And for many years, Avernus Community Services has been the zip code coordinator for Tacoma Park, 20912. So anyone who signs up, no matter who they may or may not be connected to, will get their basket from Avernus Community Services. And it's quite a community effort. Tacoma Park Avernus Church, Sligo Avernus Church, Mark's Kitchen and others do food drives and fund drives to try and help fund this distribution of baskets. And between the 2 holidays, we are projecting this year that we'll distribute something like 1,400 baskets, and about half of them will be in Tacoma Park. The rest will be in the zip codes around and up, most of them up Route 29. I should have come here earlier, but the final day for registering to sign up for a Thanksgiving basket is coming in 2 days, the 24th, 25th. Christmas baskets, we can go into the middle of November. Part of that is because we've got to work the database and do all the coordination behind the scenes. The distribution will begin on Monday at 11 o'clock on the 25th. I'm planning to invite media and other dignitaries. I had confirmation from 2 earlier today that will be there. And I would like to invite the council and the members of the executive team here to come over that morning, 11:30, and join us in a little bit and have a chance to interview some of the people that have come to pick up a basket, to lend a hand. And it's quite an event. I've been there 5 years, and I remember the first year I really got a shock because the line went out the front door and way down to the back of the building, and it was a miserable, cold morning. Oh, I got my hat, 30 seconds. So we still need some support to fill those baskets, and if you want to help us make a contribution and organize a drive, that would be greatly appreciated. Thanks. Oh, and
Thank
I
you.
have the distribution schedule that I can leave some copies.
Thank you. Anyone else care to speak this evening? Yes.
Hi, Mary Jane Machui, Ward 2, Parents of Special Needs Adults. We really, us low-income homeowners really need assistance, and I'm not going to be able to come up with my property tax this year, it's the second half, because I just had to pay $1,400 to have my front steps fixed and $380 for a plumber to unclog my only drain in the bathroom. So I'm sorry, it's just too much. And they say, oh, you fill out all these forms, but the forms are very difficult to fill out. They're complicated, and I don't qualify for only one of them. The one you make, everybody in the house makes less than $60,000 before taxes. It's the only one we qualify, me and my son. And last year we got $900 back from the city, but it wasn't until 6 months later. And you know, it's hard to survive. It really is. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Council. My name is Gregor Wallace, Ward 1. I'm here to talk about the tree ordinance review. The city residents have told you through the community survey that we love our trees, but we dislike your tree ordinance. These survey results come at a time when our aging urban forest is succumbing to the initial ravages of climate change. Based on what I've observed from your debate so far, in response to the survey and the oak dieback, the city are considering a series of conservative and limited changes to various parameters of the existing processes. My fear is that the tree ordinance and related tree canopy goals is going to be left redundant and sadly irrelevant by the stress introduced by climate change. We need to think bigger and look more critically at our processes and governance around trees. What I challenge council members to do is to perform a strategic review of all your tree management policies undertaken by the city. Ask yourselves, among other things, with our limited budget, is it more important to protect old trees or plant new ones? Does the Tree Commission and Committee of Environment give you the best information, best cutting edge, up-to-date information you need to make the decisions that you have to make? Is the age and species diversity profile of the forest suitable for combating climate change? Should a full and expanding tree canopy actually be a goal in our tree ordinance? Why is the tree canopy dominated by aging oaks? Where are the younger generations of trees? Is there a place for fruit and berry trees to create an edible forest? Was Tacoma Park not once covered in pine trees? If that's true, should we go back to that situation? What about unshaded grassland to support butterflies and bees? Why is Ward 6 quite different to Wards 1 and 2 in terms of canopy coverage? Are we actually overplaying the influence that our tree ordinance actually has on the tree canopy? Might it actually be having a neutral or even negative impact long-term by discouraging residents from planting trees? And I can share some anecdotes with you about that if you like. I would like to see far greater resources from our limited pot directed to tree planting of climate resilient species. Rather than using our time, energy, and treasure on running programs that prevent the removal of aging trees, how about a massive tree planting program? Free trees across the city, private, public land. Can the city arborist direct more time and energy on tree care and maintenance? Can we do more to keep residents up to date, educated, and informed? We have to think creatively and differently. I would like council to consider allowing residents to remove a tree without penalty if they're installing a renewable energy project on their property. I believe the city should allow residents to use their own best judgment in this case. In conclusion, question our processes. Test the assumptions that have went into making this ordinance. Seek alternative views and look forward 50 years and not back 30 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else like to make comments tonight?
Good evening. My name is Larry Silverman. I live on Birch Avenue, and I'd also like to talk about forests and trees. I think the key point is that that Tacoma Park does not have a forest policy. We have a regulatory policy which is aimed at preventing the removal of trees usually for development's sake. But there's not a comprehensive program. Now, if you look to the District of Columbia, they actually have a comprehensive program for creating a larger tree canopy and planting tens of thousands of trees. A Tacoma Park resident, Jim Woodworth, submitted some written comments. I agree with all of them. I think you need to look at that. I don't think our arborist can handle the job that's been assigned him because it's just too much for one person. I think you need to make a larger investment, not just in regulating people, but in increasing trees and the tree cover and all the benefits of trees. And that does, there may be some old trees that are special trees, 200-year-old trees or something that require a lot of attention, like the Liberty tree in Annapolis. That's fine. But for the most part, it's not necessary to keep all old trees and not have any new trees. I think we have some elements of a forestry policy. We're measuring from time to time the tree canopy. Where we have some sort of relationship with the utility companies where we can come up with plans looking forward for the year. These are all good things. We have an Arbor Day, that's good. But I don't think we take advantage of the resources around. There are people who have stated that we should not have our own arborist because the state of Maryland, the Department of Natural Resources, the Department of Agriculture have forestry people assigned to Montgomery County. I've spoken with them. They're very good people, but I don't think you could take one overworked person for the city and give that job to another overworked person for the county. But I do think that whatever you do, we should be inviting the county in. I would encourage you to take a look at Baltimore's problem, particularly when you're thinking about how much you want to invest. 10% of the trees in Baltimore are emerald ashes, and they're all dying from emerald ash borer. The cost to the city is in the millions of dollars. The cost of the residents is in the millions of dollars. So I think we need to sort of take a holistic look at this wonderful forest we have here. It hasn't changed, but it's going to change. And that change is inevitable just due to aging, but here we're going into an era of climate change. And I think we're not really prepared for it. I'll just say one thing which is sort of related. I only have three minutes, which is that we just had 2 or 3 days of intense rain. What flooded in Tacoma Park? Do we know? I think it'd be really good to find that out because we may have 10 times as much rain next year or next month or next week or 100 times as much rain. I think we need to find our vulnerabilities, not just in the public system, but also in private homes and buildings. That's part of a holistic look at everything we're doing. And I'll tell you this, if you don't have, a comprehensive tree policy, there'll be a lot of pressure to make the regulatory policy stricter and more tighter and more difficult to live with, because that's the only thing you have to save the trees. We're going to, into the next 10 years, we're going to see a lot of lost trees. And there'll always be some people say, well, let's regulate harder. That's not going to solve the problem. It's an
Thank you.
element of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'd like to stay with you when you talk about this, but I have a ball game to
Oh.
check out.
Anyone else like to speak tonight? All right, then let's move along to the council comments. I see Ms. Costick.
Thank you. I just have 2 relatively quick things, I guess 2.5. I wanted to just give a brief update to the council and residents as well regarding 2 events that I attended over the weekend and on Monday. There was an Arrive Alive Safe Routes to School program on Saturday and a Montgomery County Pedestrian Master Plan meeting on Monday. Both were very interesting and I think will provide a lot of great opportunity for us here in the city to benefit from the work that's happening throughout the county. I also want to thank our city planner and planning intern who were both attending the pedestrian master plan meeting. And there was a lot of really interesting discussion going on there about looking at everyone in the county as a pedestrian, whether you are walking a long distance or you're just walking from your car to the grocery store or from the parking lot. Everyone is a pedestrian at some point in time, and trying to build increased protections for pedestrians, not just sort of in the traditional sense of more sidewalks, but increased crossing opportunities, improved crossing opportunities, better snow clearing so that snow isn't pushed in front of sidewalks and crossings, better maintenance, just better planning overall, and also looking specifically at parking lot design as well. So unfortunately, that's going to be a longer process before we get all of their recommendations. It's about 2 years off before they are hoping to have a completed plan. But I know our staff members are going to be working with the county on that, and I think there will be a lot of opportunities for us to kind of take what they're learning and try to apply it here in the city as well. They also mentioned that they are looking into traffic calming policies as well, which I think will be very useful for us here. Related to that, they have a social media hashtag called Walking Here. If you are interested in sharing a spot you're walking that is particularly good or particularly bad, they're encouraging people to post that and tag it with the hashtag Walking Here, and they are sort of collecting the data informally through that hashtag. And there's also a community advisory group that they're going to be developing with applications out in November, if anyone is interested in that. And then on the other item I have is I just wanted to let people know that the Action Committee for Transit is planning a vigil for Julio Vargas Valerio, who was a resident who lived just outside of Tacoma Park, who was killed by a car crossing University Boulevard about a week ago. And they're holding a vigil at University Boulevard and Seek Lane this Sunday at 4 p.m. So I encourage people to attend that. I plan to attend and look for opportunities. I know my colleague here, Councilmember Searcy, has been doing a lot on trying to advocate for improved safety along the Purple Line construction and all of the impacts that that is resulting in. So hopefully we can try to bring some more voice to that through the vigil as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Duvall?
Yeah, just a couple things quickly. On Tuesday, I'll be having office hours at Spring Mill Bakery in the Junction from 5 to 6:30. Anybody wants to come by and talk about anything that's on your minds, the city related. The Montgomery County Public Schools transportation guy came out to the bus stop on Ethan Allen, and I think we finally made some progress with some options. And any council member who particularly Councilmember Searcy, who has
Additional bus stops.
difficult bus stops, I'd be happy to talk further about how to work that out, what the options are for making things easier. Were you gonna talk about the rec committee meeting?
No, you can go ahead.
Okay, so, Councilmember Searcy and I and Councilmember Kovar were all at the recreation committee meeting last Thursday, and we talked about the recreation center and a few other things, but the main thing I wanna say is if you want your child to be in winter futsal or winter basketball, it's filling up fast, and there's very few spots left, so, warning to parents to get on it. And there are scholarships available if people feel that they can't afford the fees. And last, speaking of trees and the county, I listened last Monday night to a program that Councilmember Hucker organized about county tree programs, and they went through all of their stuff, and they have some really interesting new programs that might be adapted. Some of them might be adaptable to some of the things we'll be talking about next week. So I just wanted to, if anybody wants to hear more, just talk to me later. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Searcy?
Thank you. Thank you, Councilmember Cossack. I plan to attend the Action Committee for Transit Vigil this weekend, so I'm looking forward to that. Also want to thank the Recreation Committee for a very fun meeting, as we talked about. And wonderful snacks. I mean, those cookies Jay made were amazing. So we're really happy to have the opportunity to participate in that meeting as well. I've had a chance to chat with Purple Line staff again. I have been assured that they will start working with our police chief to increase patrol along University Boulevard on the Montgomery County side of things. And that was something that we discussed previously was problematic, the need for additional police presence on the Montgomery County side. Also, we are working with them to obtain different plats or to try to figure out lines of property ownership between the project, the state, county, us, to learn a little bit more about any additional right-of-way space that may be available for tree planting in addition to any landscape designs that they already have in place. So we are still, and I'm looking at Daryl, I got some additional design plans today. I don't know how to read them, so I will share them with you so that we can get a better feel for their landscape plans, but also places where there may be opportunities for additional tree plantings.
And I've heard from a resident, talked to Daryl about it, but I haven't had a chance to talk to Councilmember Searcy. I heard from a resident who has an extensive forestry background that is interested in helping you to review them if that's useful.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay.
The main challenge that even Purple Line staff are experiencing is the fact that no one knows who owns what in the Crossroads area. The lines are very confusing. It is not clear where one county ends and the other county begins and where the city begins, or, and they've been going through as many plats as they can. And I wasn't surprised when they said it's very confusing. That is why it's called the Crossroads. So I think that'll be the biggest challenge for us. I know that Kaylee has been trying to get a better feel for whether or not we will need to start reaching out to some of the private property owners to see about their willingness to allow trees to be planted along their property. But if there are opportunities for us to take advantage of having city right-of-way, I think that'll be a quicker way for us to plant additional trees and could potentially work with the Purple Line to do so, versus having to go through private property, which would require a lot more work. So again, we're still in the early stages of trying to figure things out as it relates to plantings along the Purple Line route. But at least we got a little bit of good news today in terms of their willingness to work with us. And Councilmember Hooker has also connected us with some of the Montgomery County programs that might be available to kind of help with plantings along private property where we have folks who are willing to allow space to be used for tree plantings. In terms of pedestrian safety along Wildwood Drive and Erskine, we're still working with council members Hooker and his team to try to get a broader meeting put together to talk more collectively about resources that could be made available for traffic calming along those streets that are being negatively impacted as a result of Purple Line construction, basically cut through. We're also trying to reach out to different apps like Waze and others that have community programs as a way to see how we might be able to inform them of Purple Line construction, to kind of see them as a partner to help us with redirecting traffic, so we're not sending everyone that's trying to go down University Boulevard down Wildwood Drive through these different apps. So again, we're in the very, very, very early stages of trying to figure some of these things out. I ask residents to continue to keep us aware of what you're seeing, continue to plan events of block parties and things, because I think it's important for people to remember that this is not a highway, that Wildwood Drive is not a highway. It is a street that people live on. And so the more we help people who are cutting through to remember that, the better. We'll also need to continue to follow the process we have in place right now to get as many of those traffic calming requests together. Right now I have 2, and Daryl and I will be together on Saturday, talking to residents at Lurch and from Lurch and Kentland about some traffic calming needs that they have. We also have traffic calming petition for 7600 Wildwood Drive. And so if there are others who are working on traffic calming petitions, please let me know, and we can try to give you all what you need so that you can make sure that we're following the necessary processes. Lastly, I will have the joy of attending Monster Bash. You can't forget Monster Bash. Are you judging? I probably shouldn't say anything. But yeah, so no, we're super excited about attending Monster Bash this weekend. I look forward to seeing all of the costumes, as I have yet to pick one. So thank you.
Thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem, can I just add one other quick thing? I forgot.
Round two?
Yes, I'm sorry. I forgot to mention that we just got word that Washington Gas is going to begin a project replacing a gas main on Eastern Avenue starting next week. And so thank you to Daryl for getting the initial information, and we're still trying to get some additional information and working with Councilmember Todd's office in DC to try to set up a meeting, hopefully before then, so we can make sure that some things are in place to make sure everyone's getting the information they need, and the traffic signage and signaling between their work and Pepco's work is coordinated. But I just want people to be aware that there will be some additional work happening next week.
Thank you. And I would just like to call attention to staff, a little heads up that residents of Lee Avenue are also, as everyone in the community, worried about traffic and the speed of traffic down Lee Avenue, especially during school hours. And so they are starting to make plans for requesting traffic calming along Lee Avenue. This weekend, my wife and I had the pleasure of attending 2 open houses for the Manna Food Centers of Rockville. On Sunday, we toured their new remodeled warehouse up in Gaithersburg. But on Saturday, we had the joy of seeing their new food pantry. But it's more than a food pantry. I would call it more of a food store. It's available to people who are struggling to find the food they need to eat. But the new model that the Manna Food Center is using is, shop yourself. So when you go into the pantry, it is like entering a neighborhood grocery store. A nice, bright, clean, new place. And based on the family size, the shoppers can go through and select items from the shelves. They're have a limit only in the number of items they can pick from each shelf, so they can get a family of however many. They have a card that says, okay, you can get 3 off of this shelf for canned goods, and you can get 4 items from the produce section, and so many things from the protein section. So interesting model. It was not only impressive because of the new model, but also because of the location. It is in White Oak, much closer to Tacoma Park than their previous location up in Gaithersburg. So that was interesting. And then lastly, I just wanted to, since tonight is birthday night, right? I wanted to let the community know that the young child, toddler that fell from the 11th floor window in the Park Ritchie Apartments has survived and recovered completely. He is alive and well, and today celebrated his 3rd birthday. And we thank the Tacoma Park Police Department for helping him celebrate that. The first responders to that incident were obviously shocked at first and pleasantly shocked later to find out that the child was not seriously or fatally injured. Anyways, happy birthday to everyone. All right. We'll now move to the city manager comments.
Yeah, I have a few things, no written comments. As you know, Susie and Jason are out at various other events, and we'll be back later this week. A couple of things Susie asked me to mention. Talisha mentioned the Monster Bash. I just wanted to throw out some particulars. You can expect street closures around the event between the 12:30 and 3:30 timeframe. The event itself takes place at the Tacoma Park Middle School lot as a starting point, the collection point, as you might say, for all the participants. And then there will be a parade down Piney Branch, down Philadelphia, ending at the community center. So roads will be closed in order to facilitate that parade. There will be some cross streets closed temporarily while the parade goes by. So people should just keep that in mind. Also, information about the event is on the city's website, including details about road closures, locations, and timing. So you can check that out on the website. I also wanted to mention that next week we'll be starting our annual street resurfacing work in Tacoma Park. There's a total of, I think, 8 streets scheduled for milling and paving. So the work's going to start October 29th and extend through November 8th. We will have information on the Tacoma Alert as well as the Tacoma Insider that gives details about the specific streets and the projected schedule for dates and times. Of course, all that is weather dependent, so it may change if we get rain. The intention is to start the milling and very quickly, fairly quickly afterwards, have the paving take place. So there will be overlap in those streets. I wanted to announce, I just got confirmation literally like 30 minutes ago that we're going to be able to go ahead and schedule the intended community forum on trees, particularly the situation that's been occurring this summer with our oak trees. On Monday, November 4th. I was waiting for the last holdout of expert to confirm their attendance. So we will be joined by the community forester from the Department of Natural Resources, as well as Keith Pitchford from Pitchford Associates, who's an expert in the field that we've relied on heavily, as well as Chris Larkin from Bartlett Trees and Sarah Jensen from Save a Tree. There may be others. We've certainly invited people from Park and Planning and the county. We feel like we have a critical mass for the people that will best be able to tell us a bit about what they're experiencing and seeing, and also give some information to the public. We intend to have the meeting videoed, so it'll be available for the public. It will be taking place here in the auditorium on Monday, November 4th, starting at 7 p.m. Sure. Yeah, it's everybody is incredibly busy in the tree world, so it was very hard to get a date where critical mass of experts could agree to participate. I think that's it.
All right, thank you. Moving along on our agenda, our next discussion is the tree ordinance that we've heard about tonight, and tree canopy. The goals of the ordinance, the tree canopy goals, the tree rating chart, replanting requirements, and removal of trees and hazardous trees. Do you want to do a little introduction first, Ms. DeBala?
Sure. Can we get the slides up? What do we need to do
Oops.
that?
Is that me?
Well, they're not on my screen. There they
Yes.
are.
Yes.
And they're still not on my
Here we
screen.
go.
There you go.
Okay, doesn't matter.
Do you have an on button?
So, as several commenters have alluded to, and as you all know, the City Council has been looking at three components of tree protection in Tacoma Park: the tree ordinance, the tree canopy, and the program itself, outreach and education. We've gotten lots of input over the past year from several committees, from staff, from the city attorney, from resident survey, groups of residents who've researched particular issues. There's been a lot of interest. We've set aside 3 work sessions here in October to, to discuss policy issues with the hope that for those things for those items that relate to the ordinance, we might look at draft language and in the next month in November and move towards some decisions later this winter. Right, point at Daryl, that's what we're supposed to do here. And,
Oh,
whoop,
there we go.
a little too enthusiastic there, sorry about that. Okay, so we tried to organize this massive amount of information and topics into 3 groups, and last week, you may recall, we did look very detailed at the ordinance and specifically at the process of permitting right now, how to make it clearer, how to make it quicker, looked at the impact, looked at the part of the program that focuses on protecting existing trees in place from various activities. So that's tree impact assessments, tree protection plans, appeals, and then we also talked about appeals. This week, we hope to focus on 2 kinds of things: the removal of, or not, the removal of trees, either by waiver because they're defined as hazardous, or by permit. We hope to talk about the policy issues related to how the city rates trees and makes those decisions. Policy related to replanting requirements, which of course is difficult to talk about without looking at the overall goals of the program. So if we have time, we'd like to close by talking about the overall goals of the program. And next week, we'll talk about how to make some of that happen in terms of incentives and programs, the role of the urban forest manager, education and outreach, and many of the things that have been brought up tonight in comment. So for each of the topics for tonight, we identified a couple of key questions, policy questions, that we'd like to see if we can come to some consensus about direction for staff, so staff can write up, can do draft language or draft concrete proposals for us to vote on, to consider and vote on later in the winter. And we'd like to try to stick to the overall questions. In the slides, there are some details, but taking them in, because you have to take them in some kind of order. Yes.
If I may interject, because there is a lot we can talk about on this ordinance, I would suggest and request that we remember we're talking about trees, which are up here, not the weeds, which are down low. So let's talk
No
about
pun
the
intended.
policy issues and not the individual regulations on how those policies would be implemented. We'll get to that later, but that's not for tonight's discussion. Thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
No, that's great. So the essential question, which one of the commenters raised, is when is a tree declared to be hazardous, and therefore it can have a waiver to be removed as opposed to a permit? And the key turning point on that is replanting requirements, whether you have them or not, and how much you have them. So we have, I think, a fair amount of consensus on recommendations on 2 things. One, whether to, so the current definition, and Daryl, chime in if I misspeak on anything, the current criteria for deciding that a tree can have a waiver, and again, a waiver essentially means no replanting requirements, is that the tree is dead, or is that it's hazardous, and hazardous is defined as defective, diseased, or dead, a little redundant, and with a risk of failure, potential injury, or damage. And again, to repeat, current waivers, no replanting requirements. That's important because if we are looking, however we define it, at a healthy forest, then it puts the burden from the individual to the community to rebuild. And that's just something to keep in mind as we discuss this. So to me, the essential question is would we like to see language that expands either by definition or in some other way, expands the definition of what's a hazardous tree. The Tree Commission has recommended that we consider allowing trees in active decline. The staff has recommended something similar, and we'll let Daryl speak to that in a minute. And the resident survey of more than 500 residents pinpointed this as one of the places with the most problems of implementation. More than 80% of the residents that answered the survey identified this as being, what we do now as being too restrictive for a whole bunch of reasons. And again, I want to repeat, and if this expands and then the burden of replanting moves from individuals to the community, I don't want to lose sight of that. Daryl, is it fair to say that staff recommend that we consider allowing active decline up to 1 to 3 years?
I think it's our perspective that that's the existing program.
Okay.
Trees that are in active decline would be issued waivers if they're determined to be dead or hazardous. And I guess the definition is active decline equal hazardous? And listening carefully to Terry Siemens, I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but we do have a evaluation criteria that we use that rates trees based on their health. And if their points earned is up to a certain amount, they are considered waiver candidates. If it's above that, they're considered permit candidates.
Can I jump in for a sec? Can I
Go
jump in
ahead,
for a
yes.
second? So would you say that the chart right now, two things related to that. One is, would you recommend then if we're looking at making a change to address that through the chart? And the other is, does the chart currently, are you saying that the chart currently provides for waivers for trees that are between 1 and 3 years in decline?
Generally speaking, the chart that I'm referring to is not the 9 criteria that's listed in the ordinance for both the Tree Commission and the arborist to use in evaluating tree removal petitions. It's the chart that's in the city code that has 6 categories that the arborists use to evaluate the trees. So there's criteria in that 6 chart that deal with structural issues, longevity, as I mentioned, 6 different portions that are rated on a scale of 1 to 5. And if a tree rates 6 or below, it's considered a waiver candidate. If it rates 6 to 15, it's considered 1% replacement. If it's 15 to 24, 2% replacement. And if it's above 24, 3% replacement. So that's all currently existing in the city's code.
So I think, again, the question is whether either through the definition or through the chart, by tweaking the numbers, we want to consider clarifying or even expanding that definition a little bit, asking staff to go back and bring something to us. I would like to see, either in the chart or in the definition, some adjustments on that, provided we keep in mind, provided we keep in mind that there has still to be a replacement somewhere somehow, and that will, if the burden shifts off the individual, it's going to have to shift to the community. Anybody else?
Yeah, I would generally agree with that. I would like to see us look for an opportunity within the chart to allow trees that are actively declining and are going to be dead within 1 to 3 years to potentially have a waiver. To me, some of that depends a little bit, again, as Councilmember DeBala said, on how we offset that, because I think that's important. One question I had when I was looking at the data regarding requests for tree removals was, do you have a sense of how many people actually replant the trees themselves versus pay the fee in lieu?
I have not done that evaluation, but I can prior to our next meeting. so we can get a sense of contributions to the tree fund versus agreement to replant on site. I can provide that.
Yeah, just to give a brief overview, I did some of the general math on some of the percentages of what gets a waiver versus what doesn't, and it looked like, correct me if I'm wrong, Daryl, but it looked like it was about 55% of the permit requests or the applications for the assessments, I guess it would be, about 55% of those received waivers, and about 15 to 18% of removal requests were denied. So I guess I'm just curious, looking at sort of the total cost, it seems like an average replanting cost, which I'm sure varies depending on whether it's a 1% or a 5%, is about $500 per person. So looking to offset some of that potentially if we make the restrictions a little more lenient.
Yeah, we can crunch the numbers on that and get that back to you.
Okay, any other comments on hazardous trees? We may have to double back to it after we do some of the others.
Since I'm coming in late, can I just ask what a brief synopsis of the definition conversation, where we landed? Did we land on?
We didn't land
Okay.
yet.
Okay.
There,
This may be something I just throw in there, not to muddy the waters, but Ken may want to speak to this. The very use of the word hazardous is one that has some legal connotations. So we're going to have to be very mindful of that. If we determine or use language that says a tree is hazardous, then that at least connotes to me a higher level of response required. So we may not want to use that word hazardous if we're looking at adjusting the criteria so that we're getting decline, because like all of us, I'm now 60, I'm in decline, not quite ready to kick it in yet, but as we get close to approaching that definition of decline, we have to be mindful not to trigger liability questions or confusion related to that.
Yeah, Ms. Braithwaite, that's exactly kind of the path I was going on, which I think I concur with Councilwoman Costick of maybe looking into different definitions of when a waiver is permitted if a tree is in decline. But I agree that would probably be a different category than wanting to change the definition of hazardous.
Right, I think we're really asking for what trees do we want to grant waivers, not
Yeah.
necessarily make the hazardous definition more broad, because, I mean, we do deal with hazardous trees in the code also. I mean, people have to take down hazardous trees promptly when they're discovered.
Great, thank you.
any other comments on hazardous trees right now? Should we go on to the next one, and then we can double back to some of the details? So as Daryl was starting to say, so if you apply to remove a tree for a permit, it's not, let's say it's not deemed hazardous under the current definition. There's two things. There's criteria in the ordinance itself that describe generally what's allowed,
Did you want me to
what the
move forward?
factors are that are allowed. And there is also this chart that is what the staff actually uses to make the determination. So the questions, the tree commission has recommended based on their use of here, we'll just put that up. Oh, I'm sorry, I see what you mean. I'm pressing them wrong. The tree commission has recommended that they take that they have the most experience in using this, and they've recommended that this could use some freshening. And one question for us tonight is, do we want to go along with that and have them, so there are a couple separate questions. One is, do we want to ask them to take a look at revising these primarily for clarifying and simplifying? Then also, do we want to add any criteria at this point ourselves? So this is the kind of criteria, it's very different from the chart, which is based on the tree health and the tree size, and is less subjective, shall we say. So I think it makes sense, since the Tree Commission has the most use of this, to ask them to go ahead and take a crack at revising this. This is actually, as I said, in the ordinance itself. Where, I also, sorry, I'm going the wrong way.
It's okay.
I also wanted to get the staff to talk a little bit about the use of the criteria versus the chart, and whether we would want to consider clarifying that. But the mayor first had a question.
Oh, I was just going to go back on the criteria and your suggestion that the tree commission on this, since if I'm not mistaken, this is also the same criteria the urban forest manager uses, correct? Yeah.
The way
So
the
I mean,
ordinance is
with all due
currently
respect to the tree commission, and I'm very appreciative to all the work they're doing on this. I actually think we should start. The person who should actually do this is probably a trained arborist in setting out this criteria with input from the tree commission.
I'm not sure they meant to leave him out.
Yeah, no, okay.
And I don't have the exact words in front of me, whether
Right.
they'd said he should do it with them, or they should
Oh,
do it with
okay,
him,
yeah.
or.
Yeah.
My point was that they had recommended it. But I could use a little clarification about the role of the criteria when the forest manager goes out in the field and makes decisions, because I'm a little unclear on how that plays out in practice.
The arborist tends to use the six-point chart when he or she would evaluate a tree in the field based on an application received. So that's really the driving factor at this point to determine whether it's a waiver, whether it's a permit, and the replanting criteria, because that's all tied in with the score based on that chart. In my perspective, these 9 criteria in the ordinance, which is listed as criteria that both the arborist, the urban forest manager, and the tree commission uses in appeals, is really best geared for the tree commission to use in consideration of appeals. If someone, for development purposes or other purposes, wants to remove a tree and we deny it, these would be the criteria that the person and the tree commission would use specifically to evaluate the impacts of that decision. And to me, this type of 9 criteria really lends itself very well to appeal situations versus what the arborist is doing on receipt of an application, where they're going into the field, looking at a tree and rating it and sizing it. That's really a function of much more specificity than the 9 criteria listed here, which has to do with a lot of information that the arborist may not even know. For instance, a hardship that the applicant would suffer, that typically is not information that the arborist gets on an application, but it is something that could be presented to the tree commission in an appeal setting, which is set up specifically for that, for the appellant to make their case, the city to provide its information, and the tree commission to weigh the factors and render a decision.
So so the second question is, would we like to see language that the staff and the tree commission work together to clarify the role of the table, the role of the criteria, so people don't have the wrong impression about what they can and what is and isn't allowed?
Yes.
I mean, we're getting a couple of yeses here.
Can I just ask a question? Is that best put in the ordinance versus some type of administrative regs? And the reason I ask that is, and we can get the tree commission's perspective on this as well, and the urban forest manager, is I want these to be set, but if the tree commission, in conjunction with the urban forest manager, find that this changes would be useful in the future, being able to do that through administrative regs that we then put out to the public, get comment on, would be easier done than having a future city council take up the ordinance again and make changes to. So I just want to have us also think about what should be actually in the ordinance language versus administrative regs.
I mean, I think the criteria are really kind of the meat of the ordinance. And I mean, I think it's important to be in the ordinance. And I also don't think that they should need to be changed very often. I mean, they're supposed to, you know, allow the arborist and the tree commission to consider, you know, all the factors that are important in whether to allow a tree to come down. And, you know, I'm not saying they can't be improved, but I don't think that it's something that's going to change a lot.
But I guess I'm hearing two different things, and I just want to clarify. Like, what Ms. Braithwaite said is these are mostly criteria used by the tree commission, not necessarily the urban forest manager
I mean,
when he's out.
They shouldn't be. I mean, you can't have somebody on appeal applying different criteria than the preliminary decision maker, because you're going to get, I mean, you'll have many more appeals and you know, inconsistent results. And I think the arborist has to apply the same criteria as the tree commission. The tree commission is just taking a second look at the decision. And I hear, Daryl, that maybe the arborist doesn't have all the information he needs, and maybe we need to improve that part of the process by maybe having a more expansive application where people, you know, and we trigger people to provide the information he needs to make the decision. Because if he doesn't have all the information and denies a permit just based on the condition of the tree, you know, then we get an appeal, and then the commission gets the information that was needed in the first place. So that's just, you know, adding time and expense to the process.
So the goal is to have this list be both, as it gets edited in the future, be both for the urban forest manager in the field as he or she is deciding on a tree removal, and for the tree commission as they hear appeals. Is that what I'm hearing?
That's my recommendation. That's the way it's supposed to work now.
So I wonder if maybe there could be ways to take those criteria and incorporate them into the scoring chart in some way more effectively, so that there is, because one of the things we've heard repeatedly is that it seems subjective. And so if there's a way to actually, you know, score them in a quantitative way, I think that would be useful.
I mean, I'm not sure that's possible, because the chart is for, you know, objective conditions, and the criteria are necessarily kind of all-inclusive, and you just have to weigh different things. And in one case, you know, one factor may weigh much more heavily than in another case. And it's just they all work together to lead to a decision.
I just, and I apologize for being late. I was at a board meeting of the Tacoma Park Volunteer Fire Department, which I'm on the board of, so that's why I'm late. I just think that for the resident user of this, they would look at these 9 criteria and think to themselves, oh, well, these are the things that are going to determine what happens. And if they're not in some way, or if there's a lack of clarity, then we do need to make some adjustment one way or the other, because we can't have things listed that only get taken into account later, or that may or may not be taken into account at the beginning. And I don't know whether that means have a more detailed permit process, which we don't probably want, in terms of having it take longer or being harder for people to fill out. But I would be concerned if some of these things don't get taken into account. If they don't, then we shouldn't have them listed. And the other question that relates to that is, on the previous page, it says, add any criteria, and a question mark, risk the tree is or could be hazardous or risk to life and structures. And it says the staff comment is that that's already built into the decision, but if it's built into the decision, it ought to be listed as one of the criteria. So I'm just trying to grapple a little bit with how these criteria really are used. And I don't want to, I don't know how much we've already discussed, so I don't want to jump in the middle and complicate things, but that's the part of it I don't quite see.
It's an inherent difficulty, I think, of having both the chart and these criteria in the ordinance. And the reality of site inspection. I mean, the criteria include general health and condition of the tree as one of the 9 criteria. So the general health and condition of the tree are automatically part of the decision. With the chart, it's very specific to trunk, canopy, branch depth, likely life. I mean, it's very specifically broken out into criteria that are much more easily explainable as well as definable to a resident. So if the chart was really geared towards calculating the replanting criteria by providing that rating at the end. But I think perhaps what we need to do is make them overlay better. For instance, the second item there, number and type of replacement trees, you wouldn't have that until, that's a little bit of, you've already gotten ahead before you've gotten back. So we don't know the number and type of replacement trees until we do the chart and figure out the evaluation. And of course, right now, replanting is not an appealable item. So that isn't even a category that would be included potentially as something the applicant could raise in appeal. So we've got a little bit of a
Right.
working at 2 different ends in the ordinance.
So is it fair to say that we would like to see a proposal come back that clarifies some of this?
Can I ask one more quick question before maybe we move on? In terms of using the chart and making a determination when a removal is not permitted, how is that decision made? Is that based on an actual rating on the chart, or is that separate from the chart?
It includes the chart. It would have a rating, a tree that was rated fairly highly based on the chart. So the health, condition, and placement of the tree would all be in fair or better situations. And then in addition to that, the reason behind why the applicant has asked to remove the tree. Is it a situation where it's a sweet gum tree and they don't like the fruiting bodies on the ground, or or is it a situation that they are planning an addition and the tree is in the way of the new footprint?
So that would get back to the criteria. Okay.
But
so-
currently, denials tend to happen as a result of a tree being in fair or better condition and not being a hazard, not having any ostensible reason for removal based on the health and condition of the tree.
Okay, so if only so that it is more clear to residents, and maybe because there's some adjustments that could be made here, is it the sense then that we want this to go back to staff and the tree commission for some more specifics, specific language to mesh the 2 of these together better? And then there's the, last but not least, there's the question, if I can get that back, of adding any criteria, whether they go on the list or the chart or where they go, but there have been some things raised about why you might want to remove a tree that we should probably consider right now. Making one, Councilmember Kovar referred to, making it more clear that the risk that the tree is or could be hazardous is more clearly built into it, and is that something people would like to see? The words are sort of there, and they're and it's in the chart, but it's not. If you just read it, it doesn't jump out at you. So all we're looking for is language to consider, to ask for language that we can consider to make this more clear.
Just to provide some background as to how I see it working right now, is that if somebody applies for a permit and it makes it to the tree commission, we'll look at, you know, the health and condition of the tree, and that gives us an idea of the risk of failure. You know, the less healthy a tree is, the more likely it is to fall. And then we look at the location of the tree in relation to structures and the use of the property. And so we're looking at not only how likely is it to fall, but what's it likely to fall on. So if it's, you know, leaning over somebody's house, then, and it's in poor condition or fair condition, some questionable condition, then we're more likely to let it out. So that's how the criteria work together now.
But I guess I would just say, the process of going through the tree commission and the appeal process, inevitably that takes a certain amount of time, right? It's not an immediate thing because they only meet periodically, and, you know, it'll take some time for that to happen. So,
But the arborist should be doing that when he does the site visit.
right, but I guess not that many cases actually get appealed. And so we may modify the appeal process depending on what we decide, but there's way more decisions that are made that aren't appealed. And so if that's the case, it just seems to me if the tree commission is going to decide based on, in an explicit way, based on safety, that just ought to be in there explicitly for the initial part too. And if it says the staff build it in anyway, they build it anyway. There's no harm in just saying it explicitly, right? Because it's just ratifying what's already there.
I just don't want anybody to have be left with the perception that safety is not a factor that we use in evaluating trees now. It is, for any arborist, it is reason number one. That's
So
why
if it's
they do
reason
their
number
job.
one, let's make it
Yeah.
somewhere between number 1 and number 10 so that it's there. And there's no harm in saying.
Right, no, I don't
No.
think it's
Yeah.
problematic to
Yeah.
add it, but I just want to make it clear that we do consider that already.
Thanks for clarifying that. So I think we're all in agreement that we want to see some language that clarifies that. And as I was starting to say, then there's the question of whether we should add criteria explicitly. Ken mentioned whether or not a tree is a tree trunk. One of his recommendations is whether a tree trunk is impinging on the foundation of a house. Can we be explicit about that in the criteria, because it's not right now? So I would like to see some words that say that. Let me put the other two out there. Residents have advocated for being explicit in the criteria that it would be allowable to remove a tree for solar energy generation. And residents have advocated for including in the criteria that it would be okay to remove a tree based on the risk from the future weather changes that we can expect from climate change. So I just want to put all three of them out there. And again, the first one is sort of implied in here already. That's the question, do we want to see it more explicit? The
Which
question
is
of
the first one?
foundations and structures.
Is it,
Oh.
I read that in the
Ken, was
very,
your-
sorry.
If I could clarify my recommendation, I recommend that is a situation where we reduce the replacement costs, because it's not like a choice somebody's making. It's, a tree is taking a physical toll on their house, and it needs to come down, and there's an expense to taking down the tree, and then we add that expense of replacing it. So, I think it's baked into the criteria already.
Right.
But I think it's my recommendation just to reduce replacement costs when somebody has to take down a tree in that situation.
And so that could be put into the chart, perhaps.
We'd have to figure out how to work that into the
Yeah.
replanting requirement. We could have specific language that says right now, if a tree is impacting a foundation, we give a permit for removal. However, that permit for removal is based on replanting, based on the actual condition and health of the tree. What Ken is saying is we should emphasize the poor location in reducing the replanting requirement.
And
Right,
so-
I don't know if we could put it in the chart, but it might be like an exception to the application of the chart.
Well, we're gonna get to the chart in a minute, and one of the recommended changes is to add, to not just have the tree health and the tree size, but also have a factor that looks at the location and looks at the, they call it the target, but the potential damage that might happen if that tree were to fail. So maybe that's the way to work it in.
That might
Um,
work, yes.
Okay. Keith, did you want to say something?
Oh, no,
before?
I
I'm
was just
sorry.
gonna say what Ms. Braithwaite said, that I thought adjacent to structures or that was already in the criteria, so I'm fine.
All right, and we should probably spend a couple of moments, again, these are discussions to decide if we want to see language to make revisions, and then we decide ultimately about the language. So the two that have come up in terms of adding criteria to this list of 9 are removal, the benefits of removing a tree for solar energy generation, and the benefits of removing a tree not based on the current hazard, but on the likelihood that the tree will fail in the future because of what climate-related weather changes. For example, you're at the bottom of the hill and there's way more water than there used to be, or you're in a place where there's way more wind than there used to be. Daryl, did you want to say something? Not yet. Okay.
Having gone through this before, the last time we went through a tree ordinance evaluation, that overwhelming amount of information that the council received was that removing trees to enable solar was not an environmentally beneficial thing. There are folks that you're not going to convince either way. I guess you take your choice depending on which scientific journals you read and the information you gathered. But I could think that it'd have to be a decision that the council would make as a policy matter. I don't know that there's a whole lot more I feel comfortable saying about that, other than, that is a topic that we could spend a lot of time talking about and still probably not convince anyone if they had their minds made one way or the other. I think what was presented here this evening also shows a list of environmental benefits of trees that solar panels do not provide in terms of carbon absorption, water absorption, shading, habitat. So, it's really for you all to decide whether or not you want to
Could I
place
just
that
ask-
priority.
Right, and
okay.
just one clarifying thing. And so this is about whether it is allowable to remove a tree. Later on, we'll be talking about whether in the replanting, solar factors are considered. So there are two places where this comes up, at least, but 2 places where I've raised it. And to me, that second one makes a little more sense than this first one.
I just want to say, I'm sorry I missed the earlier presentation that you referred to. But does that vary at all, what you just described, based on the type of tree, for example, or how healthy it is, or where it's positioned? Or would it be your view that that's universally the case, that if it's a shorter tree that has less, doing less in terms of some of those benefits you made, is that a consideration, or would you say it's just that's?
Well, if we're talking about renewable energy generation, I'm assuming we're talking about solar panels, so we're really talking about large overstory trees as the impacting factor for that.
Because the smaller ones wouldn't have an impact
Right,
on it.
right. Most house roofs are 20, 30 feet up in the air, so basically you're talking about trees that are greater size than that, and in proximity that provide shade. And obviously, the health of a tree factors into its environmental benefits. The healthier the tree, the broader the environmental benefits. But we have ways to evaluate that currently. If a tree's less than healthy or declining, it's reflected in the current rating, and a removal permit is possible to get for that.
I'd like to throw one more thing in, which is that the number one write-in comment on the climate survey was that trees provide climate benefits, and we ought to link the tree program tree protection program to the climate program. So that would argue against adding this to the list at this time for removing a tree.
I just had a question, an idea that we don't have to like fully think through tonight. But thinking about the conversation we had before about the criteria, and Ms. Braithwaite, listening to you right now, is this something that should be allowable on a case-to-case basis? And again, this is just a thought, so I'm just putting it out there, and we can all, we may decide next week it was an awful idea. But if this became part of a review by the tree commission, if somebody wanted to come and make the case that either the trees were in decline, they got a good deal on solar, something's going on, that this is a situation where it should be allowable, should we look at these situations on a case-by-case basis rather than make a decision that is too blanketed? Because I'm not sure from the conversation we're having that might be a good direction to go. Like to always say, no, this can't be a reason for taking down a tree, or to say, yes, if you're gonna do solar or other renewable energy, that is a reason to take down a tree. Because it seems like there's so many variables.
I would think that would be a council decision based on policy. Currently, if someone wanted to remove a otherwise healthy tree for solar panels, they would probably get denied, and they could take that to the tree commission. So that process is now currently available. And they can make that case in front of the tree commission.
Does the tree?
Yes.
And have they made that decision before?
Oh, wait, 1 second, Tina, sorry, you're not on. Sorry, hold on. You're
Am I on?
Yeah, no.
Yeah,
Yes.
there we go. I just wanted to say that under the current ordinance, if someone wanted to take down a tree for purposes of solar panels, that would be evaluated as the development improvement on their property. And that's how we would process an appeal. Where that becomes complicated would be not in the yay or nay on the removal of the tree, but on the replanting requirements. That
Okay.
could probably change up the economics of the solar panel project.
Okay,
Okay.
interesting. So I'm not hearing a groundswell of support for considering language to allow this in the list of criteria, given that we have a way to do it now for a case-by-case basis.
Mhm. And maybe we want to come back and reconsider
Well-
the replacement.
Yeah,
after.
that's a couple slides from now. And risk from future climate-related weather.
I mean, I think, well, I know that's already, because, like I said, the arborists of the commission already look at risk, and everybody on the commission and the arborists is well aware of added risk because of extreme weather, and they talk about that when making a decision. So, I mean, risk is risk, and that evolves over time as our climate's changed. So, I think I keep saying this, but that is definitely already part of the criteria.
Mm-hmm.
Any changes that increase risk will be taken into consideration.
So in that context, like, there was one area that I'm aware of where there had been a lot of water flow last year, and a number of trees were having difficulties as a result of that, and several had fallen over or died. And so in that situation, if the urban forest manager came out to look, and the people said, look, these other three in this same low-lying area have had this, now this one's, sitting in water, the urban forest manager would be able to take into account what had happened with those other trees in the same area. And you can say that that was caused by climate change or other weather patterns. But that, if they can take that into account, that seems reasonable. I wouldn't want them to take into account we're expecting lots of rain over the next 5 years, and so we're gonna approve this. But so, would the first example be allowed to be taken into account? If I was clear about what I was suggesting there?
You mean the conditions on the site?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, definitely that plays into risk, actual conditions. And, say you have a tree that's in, questionable condition. 20 years ago, we would assume, there wouldn't be derechos and things like that. But now we know that it's more likely to have occurrences like that.
Mm-hmm.
So another way of looking at that is the recommendation that we're, the next set of questions. So you keep hearing about this tree rating chart. The Tree Commission has recommended, so the current chart that is the basis for deciding the health and condition of the tree in place, the 6 factors, the 5-point scale, et cetera. The Tree Commission has recommended redoing the chart to add a couple of factors, one being the location, they call it the site. So just exactly what you said. And the other being the target, which is another way of measuring risk to structures and people. And I think that without getting into the details of the chart, the staff generally agree with that. There could be still some more tweaking based on some of the conversation we're having tonight. But the question before us is twofold. One is, does it make sense to add these factors to capture the things we've been talking about, the site and the location of the tree that is being proposed to be removed, and the target. I don't personally like that word, so I'm having trouble with it. What damage is within the range of the tree, that if it were not to be removed, to make those more, to weight those more by having them as a separate column, and to give them more visibility, more explicit visibility as factors. And that also moves, I think, away from just the health and the size of the current tree, and starts to move into some of these criteria that were on the list. Does that make sense to people? Should we want to see that kind of language? Yes?
I just want to point out that, I mean, that's kind of I think that's another fundamental policy decision, because adding those factors would essentially reduce the replacement burden for people who have, good reasons for removing the tree. Right now, the example, and this actually happened not long ago, there's a huge tree that was actually touching the gutter of this house. It had just grown that close to it. It was a perfectly healthy tree, and it would have been fine. It would have, eventually probably knocked off the gutter, damaged the roof, but it was a perfect. If it were a perfect tree, I don't know if it was a perfect tree, but if it were a perfect tree, there would be extensive tree replacement requirements. But they're not making the choice just to take down the tree because they don't like it. So, it would reduce the replacement in those situations. And so, you got to strike the right balance between getting replacements, replenishing forest, and the financial considerations for people.
So the policy, put another way, the policy question is, do we want to look at building some of this in, or stick with what we've got? I would like to see some of this captured in proposed changes.
Yes,
But
me too.
Okay. Knowing that it's still to come, the replacement of the trees is clearly a big issue. And the city attorney, in one of his only 4 recommendations, had suggested that either in the ordinance or the regulation or some other way, that we be a little more clear about, and a little more detailed about the meaning of these words in the chart, like what is target, if we wind up putting it in there. That makes sense to me. I'm not sure whether it should be in regulation or in a handout to the resident who applies for the permit.
Well, again, I want to clarify, my recommendation for the chart was that I just felt like kind of the ranges were too great. It was, you know, hard to understand why a tree would be a 2 or a 3. I think it should be more finite, or like kind of smaller steps in the rating. Because I wasn't thinking in terms of adding the new criteria, like whether there's a target to the chart. I'm not saying that's a bad idea, but I wasn't thinking in those terms when I made my recommendation.
At the time you thought of this, you meant the existing chart. Okay. So again, does that make sense to people? To try to clarify the ranges, look at whether we can take smaller steps, or at least explain why they're big steps, and the numbers in the ratings.
What's a target?
Building, swing set, parking lot,
Sidewalk.
something for it to hit.
As I said,
If the
not
tree
my
falls,
favorite word.
if the tree falls, does it fall in woods, in the back of a ravine, or does it fall against a house or a garage or a structure?
Okay, so we've talked about hazardous trees, tree removal, tree removal permits and criteria. We've talked about tree rating, how the trees are rated and identified for approval or not. And now comes the fun part, replanting requirements. And one of the commenters said that it's hard to talk about all of this without the canopy, without the tree goals.
Mm-hmm.
That's true. We will probably have to double back and revisit some of this. But there, wrong way. Yes, right way.
That's it.
So replanting requirements, as I understand, there's a chart, a little formula that says what Daryl said before. If it's 6 points or under, you get a waiver. If it's
15.
if it's 10 points, you plant this many trees. This is just about the number of trees. If it's 25 points, you plant a whole bunch more trees or pay the fee in lieu. And this has been something that has been a problem, a difficulty for many residents financially, and also in terms of just understanding how we get the numbers. That doesn't mean it's wrong, it's just difficult to explain. Then a second but related question is the list of replacement species. What do you replace it with? And I'd like to talk about the first one first. So the current formula, again, is based largely on the rating of the health and the size. And if we change the chart to include things like the location of the tree and a little bit more about the target or the risk involved, that'll shape the number of trees that are required for replanting. The Tree Commission, here we go again with the Tree Commission. I'm sorry, I'm just having a lot of trouble getting this to work today.
Do you want me to move it?
Yeah, could you move it up to the second, that one, thank you. The Tree Commission has recommended, oh, I'm sorry, you back up one. The Tree Commission has recommended that the replanting requirements for medium and highly rated trees, so you go through this point system, and if you get a lot of points, there, if I understand correctly, you're saying that actually those should have greater replanting requirements. Could you clarify that for a minute? Sure. Thank you.
So at the point at which a removal permit would be approved for a healthy tree, it's going to be for development purposes. So in the recommendations that we offered, the replanting scale was weighted slightly more heavily towards the removal of healthy trees. So that means that if a homeowner has applied for a removal permit to remove a healthy tree that's approved, they're going to have a higher replanting requirement under our proposal over what is in the current ordinance.
And presumably the reason for that is to discourage folks from doing that, from taking out an otherwise healthy tree.
Right, and it also,
rather, I should say.
we, in the whole analysis, we always were going between the individual person, the individual tree, their individual process, versus the overall maintenance and growth of the canopy of the city. So because we allowed a little bit more flexibility on the diseased and dying trees that weren't quite dead enough to be hazardous, we wanted, that was also seen as a way of compensating in terms of the maintenance of the canopy.
Comments?
How much, I don't know if you can answer this, but how much does the replanting requirement act as a deterrent to people to remove healthy trees?
I think on that chart I provided to you, it has a slash column, or it has the information there. There's people that get preliminary approval to remove a tree and have a replanting requirement and choose not to do it. And so those numbers are reflected in that chart.
Is that what that last column?
Yeah.
That's why people haven't, they got the
Well,
permit, that's why they didn't follow through.
It is
like
my
that?
assumption that they choose not to move forward because of the cost of replanting. Again, we don't have that follow-up conversation with the applicant to say, why is it that we issued a preliminary approval and you didn't take us up on it? So we don't know 100% what the reason is. But I think a fairly good assumption is they said, that's going to be fairly expensive, I'll wait.
And that was about, it looked to me about 13% got an approval but never actually followed through with doing it, got the permit. To me, I don't know exactly the best way in terms of the exact percentages or how it interfaces with the chart, but to me, I think what we should be doing is, our city attorney referenced a few times, people having to take down a tree versus people wanting to take down a tree, and to me that is the key difference. And if we're seeing these trees as a community resource, then I don't necessarily think we should be requiring significant amounts of replacement fees for people who are taking down trees that have to be removed because they're in decline, or they're dying, or they're nearly dead, or they're impacting their house. And it seems to me that I want there to be a replacement to the canopy for those trees, but it seems to me that if they are a community resource, then it might make more sense for the community as a whole to be paying for that, not for that to come as a replacement fee.
I had one other question also, and this was suggested in one of the, we got a lot of suggestions. Whether, well, let me step back. In the LiDAR data, it showed that one of the main areas that was quote-unquote available for planting was on private land, right? And so would it make sense to offer somebody a lesser replanting requirement if they agreed to have something, have whatever the lesser amount was planted on their property? So that, in other words, the option would be, well, if you have it right here in your yard, because we want to incentivize or encourage more planting in private property, and potentially allow them to do a little bit less there. Is there a logic to that? I don't know enough how they play out, but I just thought that was a suggestion worth exploring.
Yeah, it's something that's come up before, and I think once I run those numbers for you, but for the percentage of people that pay into the tree fund versus agreeing to plant on the property, we'll have some, a little more actual sense of what that is. I think it's, from the staff perspective, we feel like we would prefer people to agree to replant and actually replant on their property than pay into the tree fund, which is used currently in the public right-of-way and parks.
And could it potentially make a difference if people were given the option? So if they have no space on their yard, or for whatever reason don't want to do it on their yard, but they don't really want to do it just because who knows where the trees will be planted, what if we said, you know, if it's on your block and you can go get a few of your neighbors, is that something where if they could pick where they would go and they would feel like it was more in their neck of the woods, would that be something that would? No pun
We
intended?
encourage people to use that option for replanting now. If they say, hey, I don't have any, I'm totally planted up, I've got shade, I can't plant a tree, you know, do your neighbors have space? Would they want it? You can do replants on someone else's property.
Right, but is there a way to incentivize that a little bit more, maybe? Because, I mean, I don't know, the average person may not feel like they want to go around knocking on their doors if it's just, you know, one more task that they have to do to deal with what they've already been dealing with. But maybe if there was some, I don't know what it would be, some
I think-
benefit to them.
I think one way to do it is to make sure that like right now, and Darryl, you would know more than I, but I suspect $175, which has been the replacement fee for as long as I can remember, is probably low,
Yes.
less than it costs to plant a tree. So that's a disincentive right there. So we should raise the, we could even make it higher than like the actual cost of planting a tree to encourage people to plant instead of pay.
And this is getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but a new program that the county planning department is piloting looks at matching. Now, they're dealing with an entire county and much bigger development, but matching developers with folks who have with private property owners who have volunteered and are already in on a list. And they have some computer program that maybe we could tap into to use. We could look into something like that. So there's incentivizing through money or through some other means, but there's also just incentivizing by making it easier, which is the route they're trying. Actively recruiting folks who want to plant a tree on behalf of someone who needs to come up with a replacement requirement. It's a thought.
Yeah, so if I may, it sounds to me, if I can check in with Ms. Braithwaite and our city attorney, that what the council is saying we want more distinction in this toward having people, and stop me if I'm getting this incorrect, if you, as Councilwoman Costick said, just want to take down a tree because you're doing something to your property, that would be on one end of a replacement, and there would be like another end of a spectrum of a replacement. Might be somebody who is taking down something, but it's not like it's against their gutter or something else. And if we could think about how we could develop a replacement plan that was more along a spectrum, and leave it for now because we need to talk about the canopy, and that might actually impact the specifics of that. But does that sound like where we were going? Okay.
So one thing that I'm often concerned about, because in my ward we have a lot of people with lawns, and you know, whereas there are some folks who definitely love to have trees planted, if you have replacement formulas in place that are so stringent, it actually disincentivizes someone from planting a new tree on their property. So let's say I'm new to the neighborhood, I don't have any trees. Mm-hmm. You come to my house, you knock on my door, and you say, hey, do you want a new tree? Plant it in your yard. It'll be yours. I would politely say no, because the maintenance associated with the tree, and should I ever have any problems with the tree, I have to take it out. If I'm familiar at all with the city of Tacoma Park, you know that you are now committing yourself to 10 oak trees planted on a 25.25 acre lot, right? You have no space. So if the goal is to And I think that's why it's so important to talk about what are our goals and what are the incentives that we're trying to build. Because quite frankly, I'm gonna be 100% candid, our tree process has a horrible reputation. That was one of the first things that I encountered when I moved here. And people told me, look, if you need to take out a tree, do it on a Sunday, because that's the only way you're gonna be able to survive. And you don't wanna create an environment like that. You wanna create an environment where people don't feel like they have to shirk the system in order to get something to maintain their property in the way that they feel is necessary. So I do encourage us to think about, when we're thinking about the replacement formula, and I get it, it's all complicated and arborist stuff that I know nothing about. But like, how are we taking into account the number of trees that people already have on their property, right? So if I'm already paying to maintain 6 humongous trees, like I've paid my debt to society by maintaining these 6 humongous trees on my property. So if I lose one, you're now telling me I need to plant 10 more. Meanwhile, my neighbor next door to me could have nothing. So it's, how do you account for the good that perhaps people are already doing on their properties? How can we figure out a way to where the replanting is not seen as a burden? Maybe it's some kind of tax benefit someone could get down the road by agreeing to repay or replace and let it go somewhere else, or finding a neighbor. I think that right now the system is set up with a lot of sticks and there aren't many carrots. And until we figure out that right balance, it's gonna be hard in some areas where you don't have as a robust of a tree canopy to really encourage people to want to plant more trees on their property.
And I just want to note that we, at our last work session this month, incentives is the topic, so we can delve more into that at that time.
Yeah, that's what I meant by getting ahead of ourselves, but it is hard to talk about any one of these things in isolation, and I agree, we don't want to have the balance of this be such that people are, because that happens in my ward too, people know that they want it, they're trying to shirk it. And we don't want that. That's not the point. That's not what we want. The last issue on replanting requirements is not just the number, but what kind of trees get planted. And currently in the ordinance, there is a paragraph that talks about
Similar or better species?
Similar or superior, I believe is the word. This was written a little while ago. Equal or superior species in terms of quality, shade, which is to say height, and other characteristics. And then there's a list, which is primarily organized by height category. And the implementation of that right now is essentially like for like. If you lose a big canopy oak, you might, they're waivers, but the replacement would be another big canopy tree, not 3 short ones. And there's been some residents have recommended that let's move to the next slide, if we can. There we go. That we modify there's been quite a bunch of recommendations that we modify this list, or modify the paragraph, or both. The Tree Commission and the Committee on the Environment said different version of the same thing, which is the list needs to be reviewed. Committee on the Environment put out that factors besides the canopy, which is to say the height, really ought to be the ecological health, the biodiversity, and trees that are adapted to the current climate. Interesting footnote, the U.S. Forest Service Research Laboratory has just come out with a list of what they expect will happen with the mature tree species in Maryland, which ones will most likely be more resilient to what we think is gonna happen to the climate. So some of that research has, as it turns out, already been done, which is kind of cool. So the question, and there's been a couple of groups of residents that have asked that the list be revised to encourage native species whenever possible. So on this one, this is partly an ordinance, but mostly a policy, mostly a non-ordinance issue. But the question before us is, do we want to send this back to the Tree Commission and staff to look at a list that incorporates more of the values that the Environment Committee recommends, that residents recommend? It seems to me the answer is yes.
And I would agree with that, but I would add that if we do change this part of the ordinance, that we would have a requirement that we look at what are the best species of trees that should be planted for our area.
Right.
It's an automatic look back.
Right.
And so just to follow on with that, to me that should, and maybe this is what you were saying anyway, not just our area in the sense of our region, but also taking into account the different parts of the city. So if you're looking to replant, down along Sligo Creek Parkway, for example, that could be different than in an area, a few blocks from here where I live, where people have a lot of lawns and whatever they have. And I would say, yes, the specific trees that get added to the list, that isn't something that the council should do in the ordinance. We probably ought to have a process, to me this would make sense, so in terms of how often that list gets updated, and if people thought that there were certain items that could be added to it, there would be a process for them to petition for that. But I do think a few broader guidelines should be there, and I'm a strong proponent. I've mentioned it before, I just want to say, I think we should say that it should be native species whenever possible, and that should be the default. Would there be a situation where on a given site in the city, for whatever reason, that site might not be appropriate for a native species? It's possible. I think we might want to say, well, what can we do to work on the site a little bit to make it there? But nativity, that's probably not the right word to use in this context, but nativeness, I'd like to see us have that be a default requirement with an ability to bail out from that depending on the specifics. So, thank you.
Yeah, I would just say, I think I would go that way versus what we have now, which is a like for like, whatever. I don't see a like for like as necessarily a standard moving forward, given wanting to move towards native species as well as the research that Councilwoman Dabala mentioned. I think we may be able to improve, and that might have been okay in the past, but I'd move away from that.
Well, one of the things that I think you need to take into consideration is there's a great likelihood that people would replace their replanting for large overstory trees with dogwoods and cherries and serviceberries, and it would be doing a huge disservice to our canopy. You will never replace the canopy of an oak with 100 dogwoods. It's just not going to happen. So we need to keep that in mind. I think what the ordinance does now is try to keep people in the same framework of tree types. We don't dictate. We just say category 2, category 3, category 4. If you had an evergreen tree, you got to plant an evergreen tree. If you had a deciduous tree, you got to plant a deciduous tree. Is trying to maintain diversity in a way that my main worry is that we may end up losing diversity if we proceed down this path of allowing greater flexibility in the replants.
There's one other thing on diversity, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I saw a document, I think it was an academic study, but one that I was able to absorb the information in, and it was talking about how in a forest, I mean, we all see forests when you're driving around places where every tree looks just the same, but if we have some control over it, that you tend to want to not have any one species be more than you know, 10% or so, and maybe in the larger family, you could have a higher percentage. So that way, if there are, you know, infestations and other kinds of things in the future that are specific to a given type of tree, you know, if you have 50% of them, that tree, you get wiped out. If you only have 10%, it's less likely. And so the diversity isn't just because it's good to have diversity because that's the host for different kinds of fauna, but also because it can help protect against those kinds of blights. And so I just wonder if there's a way to build that in. It'd be harder, I suppose, because you'd have to keep track of every other tree that had been planted, at least through the city programs. But I think it's something that's worth striving for in some way to have in there. So I would add that as well.
I just want to add, my comment before wasn't necessarily to give people more flexibility. When I was saying maybe move away from the light to light, it could be whatever list we create in conjunction with this criteria and other things with the replanting. You know, for example, if we take down a holly tree, I don't think you should be replanting a holly tree. So that, I guess I was saying, like, okay, if you're taking down a holly tree, here are your 5 other options, which are much better options than replanting a holly tree.
That's kind of what we have now with the
Okay.
categories. When you look at the category list, which is on the city's website, it gives you a broad number of trees. I totally support the information that we've got back about native species, and I think we could definitely incorporate that. I don't think there's any concern from our point on that. The one thing I will say is when you're dealing with street trees in a limited space, sticking with the native only is going to be a challenge. And the other point is, I totally understand what's being said about forest diversity, but we really have to acknowledge that we're not planting for a forest here. We call it an urban forest. If we were MNC PPC, they're managing a forest. Long Branch, Sligo Creek, that's a forest. Individual properties are not a forest. Collectively, they may serve huge environmental benefits, but when you're dealing with individual property owners and a half-acre, quarter-acre lot, it really is a different animal than an entire, 100-acre space where you do take into factors about diversity and balance, and it's just a different universe.
So hopefully we can return to this when we talk about the tree canopy and forest goals in a little bit, and also next week when we talk about what we do with city plantings versus private blending. But for now, it sounds like we have agreed that we would like to direct, ask staff and the tree commission to look at adjustments to the list based on all of the input that people have had. There are some specific questions regarding tree replanting for individual properties. Shorter trees near power lines. The county apparently has gone over to this recently and has a whole program with Pepco that Daryl may know more about than I do. I only heard about it the other night. People want to count trees that they did not purchase from a nursery, trees that, we talked about trees that are not the same type as those removed, we've agreed on that. And then the question again, shorter trees near homes for solar potential. Because right now, if you're replacing a category 1 with a category 1, you're placing a big canopy tree with a big canopy tree, assuming you have the space to put it in the first place. So any reactions to any of these right now? And some of this, like trees not purchased from a nursery, also gets into the some of these other questions about, can you encourage in pre-planting? Can people be nursing trees along that they've already got that are seedlings, and that some of those things we may talk about next week. But any reactions on this set of questions right now for replanting requirements on individual properties? To me, the question is one of space, and if you don't have room on your property, none of this makes a lot of sense. I'd be more interested in the conversation we have next week about how you encourage replanting in other places. But that's just me.
I think it comes down a little bit also to the data we were talking about in terms of whether people are replanting themselves versus the city replanting, because if it's such a small number of people actually replanting themselves, it may not make a huge impact regardless of what we do on this, or maybe we want to look at this a little differently.
That's what I was trying to say.
And not a legal observation, but a practical observation. I mean, with, like, I've tried to plant volunteer trees that started in my garden, and I move them out of the garden, they get eaten by deer. You know, if you plant a nursery stock tree, they're big enough to not get eaten by deer. So, I mean, I think that's, for longevity's sake, you know, it's important to make sure that trees people are getting credit for planting, or trees that are actually going to survive.
One thing that I do think, and I don't know if, again, I'm still learning this tree stuff, the calculation for the replanting, because I think when we're talking about this, we're often talking like there's a one-to-one replacement, and there typically is not a one-to-one. So if I need to take down a very large oak tree, then it's not, I'm just planting another oak. I may be required under the current calculation to replant 7 oaks. So I think another thing to just consider is, you know, is that calculation that we're currently using the most appropriate calculation, you know, for whatever reason. I don't know if it's the latest calculation or if it was something we've kind of grandfathered in, but we're talking a lot like this is a one-to-one, but it's not a one-to-one. If you have a very large mature tree that needs to be taken down, it could potentially be a one-to-many in terms of replacement. And is that calculation still appropriate?
Yeah, what is that calculation based on now?
And the history behind it, because I get that question all the time.
Yeah, and no matter how many times we say it, it doesn't stick in the head. Basically, the replanting calculations are geared towards replacing the canopy that's being removed from the removal of that tree in a period of 25 years. So if you have a 32-inch oak and it's of a certain condition, say it's in great shape, then that 3% replanting requirement will be replacing the canopy of that tree that you're removing in 25 years with the number of replants. So it's calculated based on how many individual 1.5 caliper trees will you need, so that in 25 years, the canopy of those replacement trees match the canopy that was removed. Now, if it's a tree in decline, you're looking at a 1% or less, so then that factor reduces the number of replants, but it's basically still, in 25 years, you're trying to replace the canopy that's being removed by the tree that's being removed.
Maybe that period of time is unrealistic for trees that that grow for, you know, hundreds of years.
Sure, I'm not really sure how to compare that. I mean, that's one of the reasons we do the canopy analysis, so we sort of see what's happening over time. Based on what we've experienced this summer, if we were to do the LiDAR study next spring, we will have lost significant percentage of tree canopy due to the loss of the oaks this summer.
Terry, were you thinking that it should be more like 10 years or more like 50 years? Or were you asking the question?
I was just saying that I think we need to think about that formula and whether, because I think, you know, planting 5 trees on a property because you take down one can be burdensome for a homeowner. That maybe we need to revisit how we do that.
Okay.
And I strongly support, you know, maintaining or refreshing our tree canopy. But I think we also have to be within, you know, some level of reasonableness for the property owners.
But I mean, that's why, I don't know what the right number is, but that's why they can be planted elsewhere, right? I agree, if you had one tree and then in 30 years you had 5 in the same spot that were maybe not quite that big, but getting pretty large, that would be hard. But I guess the idea is, well, maybe you'd only put one or none in your yard, but you would ensure that the replacement value for that lost tree would be somewhere in the city. I think that's the concept, right? I don't know enough to say that's precisely the best formula, but, you know, trees take a long time, right? I don't know.
So, Ms. Braithwaite, if someone can't plant in their yard, where do they normally plant in the city?
They pay the fee in lieu of
They
replanting.
just pay the fee? Okay.
Unless they have a neighbor or a church or somewhere else that wants the trees in their property.
All right.
And did I hear somebody say what the percentage of folks is who?
We're gonna get that information too.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So out of 100 tree permits, how many of those are able to plant on their property versus how many have to just pay the fee? And a lot of this leads to that overarching question over how much are we shifting away from the individual property owner to the community in terms of the replacement, the maintenance, and the protection, the maintenance and the replacement of the canopy. And that's a theme here that's coming out loud and clear, I think, in a lot of these decisions. So, and that leads pretty nicely into our last 2 slides. So, there's, on tree canopy and forest goals, it seems to me there's 3 questions we want to, policy questions that we want to address to help staff come back with language. One is whether we want to establish some overarching strategic goals. So Terry just said that he's all about maintaining the kind of canopy we have now, that no net loss concept. I agree. But another question is back to the native versus non-native, what kinds of tree species do we want to encourage overall? And last but certainly not least, how we would measure and implement goals. We're not going to answer all of these questions tonight, but those are I think are the key policy questions. And to just go forward one and then back up and then come back to these questions. Daryl, see what you think of this. To me, the current ordinance implies some canopy goals to protect, to preserve, and promote the urban forest, which is to say the big trees. It's a focus on the canopy of the big trees, and as Daryl said, to maintain it by replacing any trees we lose within 25 years. The tree canopy assessment that we just had done, some of you will remember that a few years ago, the Tree Commission and the Environment Committee at that time recommended that there be some kind of tree canopy goals, and that led to this most recent tree canopy assessment. And the 4 things they said was 60%, give or take, is pretty good for this area. Most of the other communities with tree ordinances like ours are flirting with 35–40%. They recommended that preserving the existing canopy, stretching those mature trees a few more years, working with residents to keep the current trees healthy, et cetera, is a critical piece, and that private property is a key piece. As much as we want to talk about the city planting program on city rights of way, they recommend that we really focus on private property and that we continue periodic mapping and inventory. So that was the 4 things they recommended. The Tree Commission recommended numeric goals by which they said establishing a long-term set of objectives 20 to 25 years out with periodic assessments every 5 years. So not necessarily to get hung up on the number, but to look at a set of objectives that go out over 20, 25 years and define how we would like to get there and do the assessments to see if we're meeting them. they described a community ownership of goals, by which I think they meant the kinds of things we'll be talking about next week. How the community can, what incentives you provide, what education and outreach and support you give to people. And the third thing that they said in their recommendations, which you have attached to your blue sheet, is to focus on a set of strategic goals that have specific action steps, implementation that goes with them, like prioritizing planting on private property, just to pick off one off their list. The Environment Committee, and many of the sub recommendations have to do with the program and the incentives and the kinds of things we'll be talking about next week. The Committee on Environment also had more of a strategic vision in their recommendation and a lot of suggestions for program implementation and, again, incentives and ways to shift the burden from individual owners to the community and so forth. Their vision for the kind of forest we would have would emphasize ecosystem services, climate mitigation and resiliency, and biodiversity. And specifically, they called out, I can't remember if the Tree Commission did, they called out targeting underserved neighborhoods, figuring out where they are, and going after them to boost the canopy in those areas. And if I'm remembering correctly, as a overall goal, both groups thought that maintaining the kind of percentage we've got now would be good and ambitious, rather than the kinds of things we were talking about 5 years ago. If I'm mischaracterizing anything, somebody let me know. But for the purposes of summary, I tried to hit the high points. So,
Ask a question?
yes, yeah, please, since we have them all collected here.
I appreciate the idea of targeting the underserved neighborhoods, but how would we do that?
That's a really good question.
Because this has been a priority, I think, since I've been on the council, and there hasn't been like this big push to, have a whole bunch of more trees planted in Ward 5. So what will we do different to reach this goal?
Anybody?
We can talk about it later.
Well, maybe we're putting
I have a
people on the
question.
spot.
I have a question about it.
Yeah,
We did have a specific proposal.
yeah, which you have in front of you.
So
Yeah,
one of
so,
the
and it
things
is, it is one of the primary incentives for that sort of thing, is one of the main topics for next week. And in all fairness, not everybody's had a chance to read and absorb the details of this. But there are some proposals, some ways in here that they suggest to do it.
No, the only thing I wanted to ask was, I don't know whether a ward by ward percentage really gives us what we want, although that's a decent way to look at it. I want to make sure we don't, it's really important to address the under-canopied areas, but maybe staff could check on this and get back to us later. One of the things I've just been curious about is, and maybe to Alicia or Terry would have some observations on this, but New Hampshire Avenue, you can't really plant trees on New Hampshire Avenue, right? So what I don't have a sense for is the presence of New Hampshire Avenue a big contributor on its own to the lesser canopy there. Now that obviously gets to historical question about why New Hampshire Avenue was put there, but I want to make sure that we're not saying, well, we'll plant more trees in an area where there's mainly pavement, unless we're going to change that into a boulevard and do those kinds of things. So I don't have a sense for, or maybe there's lots of parking lots by the large apartment buildings in Maple. We could address that too, but we should know what it is, as opposed to just the trees have been left off areas where they could be planted. I guess that, I don't know if there's a way to figure that out.
Past arborists, I think, have said it quite well. The main difference for lesser canopy in areas, say, for instance, Ward 6, has to do with the way it was developed and the time frame in which it was developed. 30s, 40s, 50s, it was tract development. So the entire block was bulldozed, houses built, and a few trees
Right.
planted versus what's happened in the older parts of the city where there were individual house lots, individual house built, and the existing trees, for the most part, were.
So does that mean there's
were kept.
actually less plantable
No, I
land
think you
there,
can
or-
see in the canopy analysis, the percentage of available space is
Okay.
equal, if not greater,
Okay.
in those places than.
Yeah, that's what I was just getting at, actually, because that's what I remember.
Yeah.
I think the main challenge is coming up with a strategy that will work for, single-family homeowners, helping people to get to the point where they don't necessarily consider the trees as burdensome, which is very true. We have to keep in mind that we're not just talking about the cost associated with taking a tree down, we're talking about the cost associated with maintaining trees on your property. And so for some residents who may be income strapped, that could be problematic. It's also gonna require us to rethink our approach to the commercial parcels. How are we engaging with the property owners for some of these large commercial lots? How are we engaging them as we're talking through things like, development and trying to create more walkable kind of business approach to things? How do we introduce trees into the conversation? That's one of the reasons why we're pushing so hard on the Purple Line staff in terms of trying to figure out how we can have more trees planted along University Boulevard. Quite frankly, what they're planning right now will be to basically clear out all of University, like widening University Boulevard, current sidewalks, current mature trees that are along University are being taken out. They're doing that along the entire route of the Purple Line. And when you look at their landscape plans, they're planting shrubs. So how do we start pushing these conversations now, understanding the property rights and lines enough to be able to identify places where we could plant more trees? I think that's gonna be the difference. It's gonna require a little bit more than just, trying to, for lack of a better word, tax private property owners. It's kind of bringing them into the fold and helping them realize the benefits of having trees on their properties.
So this is certainly not the only, but one way to increase, in quote, the underserved, unquote, neighborhoods would be to put some attention, some more attention on the issues related to the Purple Line, because it's right in front of us right now.
Yeah. Green Street Boulevard kind of approach. I think as we're also talking about, trees were planted along Wildwood, people like them. Identifying other streets, residential streets, where maybe we're planning sidewalk projects, and making sure that there's some plantings associated with those, I think are really, really important. I also think that as we're thinking about public space and the creation of public space in wards that currently don't have as large of a tree canopy, that we're starting to think creatively about, vacant lots that may become available and creating, pocket parks and things like that. So as we're thinking about public space and whether or not we may be able to access some of it, thinking about it from the perspective of how can we use these spaces to, increase the tree canopy in addition to providing public parks and things like that more in some areas that don't have as many places to play. But again, that requires us to think strategically, and would require us to kind of think of ways to combine the tree canopy goal with some of our other goals and other projects that we have underway. I think that's gonna be the only way to do it. The same way we incorporated sustainability into the Housing and Economic Strategic Plan is gonna be the same way when we start thinking about our open space management plan, that we try to incorporate some of this into that too.
Adding to that, I'd also like to see us maybe rethink how we do the street right-of-way plantings, because it's my understanding that it's currently by request of the residents. And it seems like maybe to get into some additional neighborhoods that haven't requested trees at this point, maybe it would be useful to go to them and approach them with it, or to have a city project where those trees are put in, and then there is regular maintenance by the city of those trees.
Yeah, it's typically kind of a combination effort. It's identifying, the arborist identifies spots where trees are missing or where we've removed trees over time. So they kind of keep in their mind areas where we have a lot of tree space available. And then also, we always try to be responsive to residents. So as people contact us, we do keep that in mind. So it's kind of a combination of the two. It's not resident request driven only, and it's not city staff driven only. It's kind of a combination.
So this is getting a little ahead, again, going to what I thought we were gonna talk about next week, but if I could paraphrase, both the Tree Commission and the Environment Committee talk about a more strategic look. So the Environment Committee calls it a prioritized city planting planet map. The Tree Commission talks about strategic goals linked to concrete actions, but both of them are talking about, I think, essentially a strategy rather than what we have in addition to what we have now, the permit program. There's resource implications to that, for sure. But it makes sense to me that we would want to go in that direction. I'm less, next week we'll also talk about the third one, the numeric goals in the on-the-ground inventory, and that's resource intensive too. So those are things we want to kick around a little more next week. Again, if I'm misrepresenting, since y'all are sitting here, let me know. But for tonight, I think the essential policy, for tonight's purpose, I think the policy question is either in the ordinance or in some kind of resolution, would we want to establish some strategic goals to just say once and for all what our overall direction is? Do we want to go beyond the focus on canopy into some of these other areas? And do we want to reflect that in either ordinance language or resolution? Or do we want to just say, we've got enough going on right now, we don't want to deal with it?
Go ahead. I would just say that I would support the setting the base policy goal of no net loss canopy.
I was gonna say the same thing. I mean, given the loss that we are experiencing right now, and I can't remember if this was from the presentation we had from the University of Vermont or just talking to I feel like I've talked to a lot of arborists in the last couple of months. Some who have worked in the city, some who know the city well, and over again, what I've heard from people is very consistent, is that we have been incredibly fortunate to have the canopy we have and have some really majestic, large trees. Many of them are coming to the end of their lives. And that, I mean, I've heard that from arborists who work in the city, arborists who just know the city. And so my concern is no net loss. I'm not sure like we can actually do more than that given where we are right now. And I think it may be hard for us to even match no net loss, so.
And I think a subset of that is to aim for increased biodiversity.
Yes. Yeah, I would like to do that in the, and a more, I would say, strategic approach to our canopy. I'm not sure, I would say targeted areas or neighborhoods more than a strategic approach.
But I just want to, it's important to make sure that no net loss doesn't end up becoming doesn't get translated into a set of policies that don't enable us to try to do more for areas that are underserved. You know what I mean?
Undertreed, do you mean?
Yeah, because it could be relatively easy. Well, all we got to do is replace the ones where they've been losing. Well, we want to add to
But
areas that
the
haven't had it too.
No net loss doesn't say where. It just
Right,
says-
I was looking at the
Right.
first one, it says canopy citywide.
Right,
Right, I just,
Yeah.
all I'm saying is that we have to make sure that when we do that, that it doesn't just become,
right.
a-
Eye for an eye and a tree for a tree.
yeah.
Yeah, I would like to see us be more strategic, so it's not a tree for a tree.
Yeah.
Which has given us what we've got now, so we can't knock it too much.
And I feel like the next bullet we've kind of talked about before. right?
Yes,
So we need, all
we
right.
have. And so I'm hearing that people want to see some words either in ordinance or resolution form that set an overall strategic goal and encourage biologic diversity, focus not just on canopy. Everybody's shaking their heads, that's good. And being strategic about building up areas that are, for lack of a better word right now, underserved. And I'm gonna go for it, and encouraging native species and discouraging invasives, which are currently termed undesirable. So one of the questions that a bunch of folks had posed is, could we just switch from undesirable to invasive? And they're not the same thing.
And I would go away from encouraging and discouraging as close as we can to requiring and banning. We should certainly ban invasives as part of the city plan.
I'm less supportive of the native versus non-native. As we look at the climate change, we may need palm trees the way things are going.
So it's not any deep love of Bradford.
Yeah, but that can
Paris.
be built into the language. The language can easily say that we want natives unless they don't work.
You'll be relieved that palms are not on the list of the Maryland native species that will do well in, I forget the time horizon of the analysis.
I mean, I
And,
think the,
go ahead, I'm sorry.
no, I'm sorry, we've gotten so many recommendations, I'm trying to remember which one I read.
Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah.
This weekend, but I think the latest one, and I don't know if it was in our packet that we received specifically on this issue, I thought was going in I thought looked like it was going in the right direction.
You're talking about the 39 people who wrote about native
Yeah.
species? And they were mostly talking about the citywide, the city planting and replanting in the right of way, although it has implications for the,
Right.
all of this stuff, the
Yeah,
the
it was
list.
my assumption that it would be primarily geared at the replanting requirements
Right.
associated with tree permits, because that's the bulk of where the planting's gonna take place. The 100 trees that the city plants per year in the right-of-way could certainly be part of that.
Yeah.
But the vast majority will be the replantings required based on the permit
Right,
process.
and that's what we're talking about here, right?
Mhm.
Yes.
Okay.
And I think we've talked about climate change adapted, that we'd like to see that reflected. I don't quite know what to say about high in carbon absorption, because I'm not familiar enough with the scientific details to know whether there's a significant difference among native tree species in carbon absorption. And maybe that's just something that Daryl can come back to us next week and say if we know that or not.
It's worth looking into, I think, right? If it's easy to look into.
Jeff, can I call on the Committee on the Environment? Do you have anything to say on this? Carbon absorption.
I think there is some data on some tree species that absorb carbon better than others.
Okay, so maybe that would be something to work
You have to
into the
repeat it 'cause
list.
people,
Pardon?
just repeat what he said, because you're not
Yeah,
gonna be able to. hear.
so the representative from the Committee on the Environment said there is some data on which species are higher carbon absorbing than others, and we're gonna ask them to roll that info into look at the list. And I wanna throw one thing out that I talked to someone from the US Forest Service at length this week, who said that from their perspective, the carbon absorption and the carbon sequestration is important in terms of dead trees as well, whether in a situation. For example, the private properties in the back of Forest Park, leaving dead trees in place for wildlife benefits and for, rather than removing them from the property, that was something that they have seen research on as a more useful from a climate point of view. So I just throw that out there. And our last question for, did you want to say anything? Our last question for this evening had to do with the tree commission recommendations on measuring and implementing goals. And again, we weren't gonna conclude anything about that, but I wanted to call everyone's attention to the fact that they've done a two-page, a one-page write-up on this question of whether you want to follow a tree inventory with an on-the-ground inventory of, let me rephrase that. Whether you want to follow the tree canopy assessment that we have done now a couple times with an on-the-ground inventory either of city trees or of private property trees, and if so, how you'd go about doing it. We've also, from the same U.S. Forest Service source, received a bunch of information about citizen science ways to do it. Again, resource intensive, even if you do it with volunteers, has implications for resources, and it's a really good question that somebody raised earlier, how we want to spend our limited resources, whether we want to spend it on the on-the-ground inventory or on incentive programs or on some other thing related to trees. But I wanted to just call everyone's attention to the recommendations that we've gotten from the two committees on this topic.
So, can I put forward a proposal, given that this is a fairly pricey thing to do? This is the type of thing we would talk about in our priority setting and when we're doing the budget. I feel like we can't make a decision on that right now when we're talking about something that's gonna cost upwards of $50,000. So.
And by then, we would probably have been through at least once all the discussion about whether or not to shift the program more toward education, et cetera.
Well, and I think we also
what
have our
that would look like.
sustainability, climate
Yeah.
sustainability, climate change sustainability plan, I think.
Right, and how they all fit together.
Right, and how all those fit together and the resources we have and where we can pull resources. I think it has to be a holistic conversation and not just done in isolation now.
Yep, I agree. Do we want to recap, or do we want to, does anybody have anything? Daryl, do you have enough to go on? Do you have too much to go on?
Too much, probably.
You good?
Oh, you're waiting for an answer?
No, you're
Sorry,
good.
I'm waiting for an answer.
There's like, I want to go home and celebrate
It's
my
a
birthday.
It's a little foggy, but we will get there.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
And in your honor, we've concluded at 10 o'clock.
Before midnight.
Before midnight.
Yeah.
I passed that down,
Is there anything else tonight?
Thank
No, there's nothing else. Are we good?
Yes.
Okay, we're good.
Yes,
We're done.
yes.
Let's see what the crowd.
Oh, cool.